A warm welcome to everyone joining us here today, lovers of history, philosophy, and activism. I'm Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel, the chair of the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center, a group of dedicated individuals committed to informing the public about the past, present, and future of our city. Our warmest thanks to all of you for joining us as well to commemorate the remarkable life and work of political theorist, one of the leading political theorists of the 20th century, Hannah Arendt. Our thanks also go to the remarkable Brennan Center for Justice, an outstanding, influential, not-for-profit law and public policy organization, for their generous technical assistance today. Without them, this program would not be possible. For those of you who have asked, today's Zoom program will be recorded and the video available actually in the next several days through the Diamonstein-Spielvogel video archives at the David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Duke University. And now for our program. Hannah Arendt was a humanist, thinker, and one who thought boldly and provocatively about our shared political and ethical world. She was arrested for her Zionist work in 1933, became a prisoner in Gur's concentration camp. That was an earlier detention center in Basque Country near Spain, and she escaped through the waterways and arrived in the United States in 1941, a stateless Jewish refugee. She was the author of several of the most influential books of the 20th century. Arendt's conception of politics is based on the idea of active citizenship that reinforces the value and the importance of civic engagement and collective deliberation about all matters affecting the political community and its thinking. Arendt argued that one must see the world from many perspectives, not so that one finds truth, but in order to lead a meaningful life of freedom as well. Her legacy and her relevance today remain entwined with her work on anti-Semitism, her critique of totalitarianism, and her exploration of the relationship between politics and lies. Today we have a very rich program of renowned scholars, activists, and educators. Our first speaker, Leon Botstein, is president of Bard College since 1975. He was trained as a violinist, conductor, and historian, and has been the conductor of the American Symphony Orchestra, among others. His widely published writings include books on education, history, and music in German and in English. A consummate artist, he has performed as a conductor around the world, appears in numerous recordings, and under his leadership, Bard has become an established liberal arts college with a series of meaningful outreach programs which support and underserved communities. These efforts to engage others in the life of the mind, like his life and work, stem from his interest in and focus on the creation of a more equitable world through education. Welcome to you, Leon Botstein. Can you speak a bit about your relationship with Arendt? I have been told that she advised you on your own thesis. So obviously The relationship was a very long-term one. It suggests certainly that you knew her for many years. How did you and Bard come to have such a close relationship with her?
Well, thank you very much for having me. The answer to the question has two parts. Her relationship to Bard comes prior to her relationship with me. Her husband, Heinrich Blücher, was hired in 1951 to teach at Bard. He was hired actually to design a general education course, a kind of common core course for all entering students. And it was strangely and oddly similar to a very large book that had been written by Karl Jaspers, Hannah Arendt's thesis advisor, the great German philosopher who was a big influence and a close friend of Hannah Arendt. And Blücher created this course basically about the great philosophers, which he ran for many years. So Hannah Arendt's relationship to Bard was that it employed Heinrich Blücher full-time as a professor of philosophy. And as a consequence of that, when Heinrich Blücher died, he chose and Hannah chose to have him buried in the Bard Cemetery, where she is buried alongside of him. And there is a constant pilgrimage to Bard to visit her grave. In addition, that explains why she gave her library, personal library, to the college, and why we have a Hannah Arendt Center that Roger Berkowitz has developed, which is a forum for ideas and conferences and fellowships in her, which carries her name. My own relation with her is independent of that in a way. So I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago in 1963 when she was in her first year, and she gave a public lecture about her book on Eichmann, a very influential book about the trial, which originally were a series of articles in the New Yorker. And they ignited an intense controversy about what people read her as saying, which is a little different from what she actually was saying. But among the uncomfortable truths that she put on the table was the complex and difficult relationship between the Jewish leadership of the victims, that is to say, in many places in Europe, the Jewish communities were organized, and the Jewish community were enrolled, if you will, by their own choice in the communities, in the Jewish communities in their cities and towns, and the leadership of the Jewish community, not so much the rabbinical leadership, but the lay leadership, got involved in an attempt to save their own people by thinking they were doing the right thing, by working together with the oppressors, with the Nazi authorities. And in her book, she looks at, for example, the ghetto in Lodz, and that Chaim Rugenkowski was the head of, and the very difficult, complex leader of the Warsaw ghetto, who eventually committed suicide. And these are uncomfortable issues, because what the Nazis successfully did was so dehumanize their victims as well as kill them, that their struggle for survival made them invert all the normal things that we associate with the right thing to do. Well, long story short, I come from a family of survivors. My grandfather was asked to be on the Jewish Council in Lodz and fled. And he survived the ghetto and camp. And I spent a lot of time growing up with him. And the war was a constant topic of conversation. When her articles were written in the New Yorker, although he didn't speak English, he did read English. And so he gave them to, he said to me, you should read this. This is the most honest and most penetrating thing written about the Holocaust. This is from a survivor who had, my uncle was killed at the time of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in Warsaw, and after whom I'm named in 43. So this is a man who lost children, his entire family, his entire world, and barely survived. And he was saying, this is truly the most important thing you can read. I was 16 years old. So I went to the University of Chicago, and there was this public lecture by Hannah Arendt about, and it was packed. And after the lecture was over, she was attacked vigorously by people in the audience, as if she were blaming the victim and insensitive and so forth. And so after it was over, I sort of, if you're a musician, you're used to audiences and people don't like your work, you like to make the person feel better by saying, well, you liked it. So I thought I would go up, and by the time I got in the end of the line, I said, Professor Arendt, you don't know me, I'm 16, but, and I told her basically the judgment of my grandfather. And she looked at me and she said, what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm a first-year student in Chicago. And she said, well, I have office hours on Thursday. Come see me. And that's where the relationship developed. And then when I did my senior thesis, she was one of its readers, and she helped me solve a bunch of issues by putting me in touch through her with Jaspers with a bunch of questions. And then we sort of stayed in contact, and she played a very important role behind the scenes in my getting the job at Bard. So, and she had, I saw her, several weeks before she died, and she died suddenly. And her plan was to live in their country, cottage across the river and begin teaching at Bard to help me, because I was very young and inexperienced, to try to revive. She was very attached to the college, knew a lot of people on the faculty, so she wanted to give me a hand. I was very grateful. Unfortunately, she died, and that wasn't possible. So that's how I know her, and that's the story.
How relevant do you find her work for today?
Well, the two things about her I would say is that I've written on her Jewish writings, the early Jewish writings, which came out in the 70s in English. And I would say that two things are relevant. One is that she was a brilliant example of what it means to be courageous as a thinker, where thinking is actually doing. If you were in her classes or you went to seminars, she was one of the few people that really revealed the process of her thinking. She thought aloud. If you responded to a question, it was like seeing a great watch mechanism operate. It was just inspiring to see how she thought, how she made connections, she pursued tangents. But in answer to your question, her work is, in my view, both the human condition and the origins, and other work point out the importance of individual intellectual autonomy, commanding language, and not simply imitating how other people speak. The importance of citizenship and active citizenship. The significance of the arts. This is not a common area, but she's very articulate on that, in the constitution of the self inside a free society. And also the significance of a concept of membership in the human community that's not based on race, ethnicity, and a superiority of one set of circumstances that people find themselves in by birth to another. So there is a kind of optimism. Also, the other thing that was always impressive was her faith in the renewability of when we are, as she once had a collection with this title of In Dark Times. So I do think that her writing is inspirational, and her understanding of the dynamics of terror and of what autocratic rule, the origins, is very shrewd on how the creation of fear and the moving of victims of secret police and terror, that anti-Semitism is not simply a decorative part of Nazi ideology, but crucial to itself and crucial to its mechanism of survival and of forging solidarity.
Do you share her optimistic view?
Absolutely. Pessimism is the easiest way to show someone you're smart, because everything ultimately will disintegrate. So if you wait long enough, a pessimist has got to be right. The hard thing to do is to avoid being a foolish optimist. In other words, to actually believe in the capacity for the human species to do better or to start again. So it's too facile and that's why critical observation of the world is helpful, to understand why people who otherwise are not radically evil, but simply helpless to withstand adopting something that seems so popular, even in our own country. So the people who will vote for Trump, or the people who vote for DeSantis, or the people who are nativist thinkers, or act in a prejudicial way, or these are people whose belief systems can't be simply made fun of. You can't have a Puritan sense of superiority to them. You have to find a way to understand why people think differently and do one's very best to try to get them to rethink their position, whether it's even the anti-vaxxers. And without a common ground of understanding what might be certain or true, without an epistemological agreement, if you will, among us, it's impossible to have a democracy. And you have to fight for that. One of the problems we face now is that people holding positions have a tendency to believe that their positions make them morally superior, and the people who don't hold the positions are inferior. One of the things she made quite clear is that the Nazis were able to make radical evil look normal through legalistic, linguistic tricks, train schedules, efficiency, distortions of the idea of law. So a lot of people end up unwittingly going along with something that, if they were able to rethink it, might put up resistance. So I do think, I'm an optimist, definitely.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you for your thoughtful and provocative remarks, Leon Botstein.
Thank you for having me.
And our next speaker is Jana Schmidt. She's the Director of Academic Programs at the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. Her essays have appeared in the Journal of Narrative Theory, the German Quarterly, Philosophy Today, and the Journal of Arendt Studies. Jana has taught at the Pre-University in Berlin, the Bard Prison Initiative, and California State University in Los Angeles. Her book, Hannah Arendt und die Folgen, or Hannah Arendt and Her Legacy, was published in 2018. Welcome, Jana. You briefly mentioned to me that as a native German, I asked how you came to be interested and how you came to Bard. Your interest in Arendt first stemmed from curiosity about her Eichmann book and the accusation that it was anti-Semitic. How has your understanding of Arendt and anti-Semitism changed since then?
Yeah, growing up in Germany, anti-Semitism was always a big topic for me to understand what happened. And when I encountered Arendt, it was in the context of an American studies class, interestingly. So she wasn't actually read a lot in schools at the time or in the context of sort of like German history or German cultural studies. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it was in the context of an American studies class. So I encountered her views on anti-Semitism and then realized how complex a phenomenon anti-Semitism is. So basically, I think one of the sort of like reigning theories in academia and even in popular consciousness was that the Jew is a scapegoat for essentially sort of a symptom for or a release valve for other things going on. And she really complicates that view by looking at the interaction, so the relationship between Jews and Gentiles. Her contribution is to think about how does anti-Semitism grow historically out of the particular relationship between Jews and Germans. And it gives Jews an agency that has often been misunderstood or misconstrued as guilting the Jews. But I think if we actually read the chapter on anti-Semitism and origins of totalitarianism, that's not a defensible position. She's not saying that Jews are responsible for anti-Semitism, but she's pointing to the political agency of Jews. And in her later writings that Leon invoked on Zionism and on when she calls for a Jewish army, she can draw on that. She can say that there's a long history of sort of apoliticism, if you will, and she says that that has to end. Jews have to become politically active. They have to find political and create political representation. So that's how I encountered her first.
And since you've written about Hannah Arendt and her legacy, I wonder if you would summarize for us your view of her legacy.
Oh, yeah, that's a difficult. I think one of the fascinating things that I realized when I was writing that book is how many people have been inspired by Hannah Arendt. I think in the US, the picture has often been limited to political studies and perhaps certain parts of history, but not even. And really, if you look at a more global context, her influence on things like post-structuralism and feminism and post-colonial theory is quite remarkable. It keeps growing, right? There is more and more scholarship that is inspired by Arendt, that is arguing with or against Arendt. So I don't think it's I think it would take me hours to sort of like summarize the impact that Arendt has had. But perhaps just to sort of like give a suggestion as to why her impact has been so great. I think it's because of the many languages she speaks. So literally the languages, she wrote all of her books, almost all of her books in 2 languages. So they are different. But she also, she cites Greek, she cites Latin, she cites French. And she has an understanding of the multiplicity of human languages that sort of invites us to keep thinking about those texts.
would you have had the opportunity to study in depth as you are now in your homeland?
Would I have had the opportunity?
Or does one?
To study Arendt? Oh, yes. Yeah, absolutely. There's a thriving Arendt scholarship in Germany now, and with special emphasis, I would say, on Arendt as a poetic thinker, as a thinker about literature and the arts, which perhaps is not so strong in the United States still. But the impulses from Germany are sort of like coming over to the US now and to other countries. And that's partly also due because owing to the fact that her texts are a lot more poetic in German, where she's sort of like drawing on the wealth of her childhood memories and her schooling in German poetry and so on.
Well, you've traveled a good distance. What are the most significant things that you take away? Her views on colonialism, which?
I mean, I think in a way, the most significant thing that I've taken away from my study of Arendt or traveling with Arendt is that the idea for me is not so much to find a home in one particular place, but to continue to move. Yeah, so there is a kind of mobility to her thinking that I find inspiring for thinking about travel, about exile, about errancy, about the refugee condition, and so on. And I think it's worth embracing that rather than trying to kind of stabilize her work and ourselves, really.
Well, that's quite a note to end on. Thank you for your important contribution, Jana Schmidt. Our next speaker is David Bromwich, the Sterling Professor of English at Yale University. He is the author of American Breakdown, The Trump Years and How They Befell Us in 2019. Seems like a second chapter or a second book is in order there. How Words Make Things Happen in 2019, and a new introduction to Arendt's On Lying and Politics, issued in September 2022. He is a renowned authority on Romantic and modern poetry and the history of literary criticism. He's written extensively on the relationship between poetry, criticism, and public life. His skeptical music, Essays on Modern Poetry, won the 2002 PEN Award for the Art of the Essay. But you certainly seem to have traveled a good distance in your thinking. You are currently at the work on a second volume about, I think, a favorite subject of yours, Burke. Tell us what has drawn you to the political landscape, from romantic poetry to the political landscape of our current past. And welcome to you, David Bromwich.
Thank you. I can answer briefly about a connection between Burke and Romanticism and Hannah Arendt, but I understood myself to be invited to give a short talk. I actually wrote something. May I read that, or would you rather just go back and forth?
No, you may read that, and then perhaps we'll have some time to go back and forth. And thank you for taking the time to do so.
Let me just begin with saying that I was surprised when I read The Origins of Totalitarianism, not as early as I might have. I think I was in my 40s when I read the whole book. To find Burke playing a somewhat important part in Arendt's treatment of prophecies or foreshadowings of the analysis of mass society and the germ of totalitarianism that she was working at in her great book. And so the idea that the more you closer you get to a society where everyone feels in the mix. Everyone feels they ought to have a say, or everyone has to be appealed to by government, often a despotic government, but also a democratic government. The more emphasis there is on consensus, and consensus that can move towards uniformity, and uniformity that can move towards something total and therefore fearful. So that is a thought Burke conveys, I think, to Arendt, among others, and it's part of the subject of the short thing I wrote. So let me read that now. Totalitarianism is a word and an idea with which, thanks to a brilliant diagnosis and criticism of the phenomenon, the name of Hannah Arendt will always be associated. But Arendt, like her near contemporary George Orwell, was less fascinated by the noun, the ism, the perceived artificial entity, than the adjective totalitarian. For there is a totalitarian germ in every modern technological society. The instruments, that is, for totalitarian control, already exist, and some of them are already deployed, even if selectively and half buried under pretext and euphemism. So it shouldn't have been surprising that Arendt would devote her final years not to analysis of the residues of fascism and Nazism in Europe, or of Stalinist communism in the Soviet Union, but rather to documenting and appraising the consolidation of state power in the United States, as in her book Crisis of the Republic, and especially of war powers that could be redeployed and turned back on citizens at home. She had seen firsthand in Germany the effects of a totalitarian order, in the politics of the country most obviously, but also in what came to be the pervasive morale of a broken and monstrously renovated society. Arendt was not surprised in the post-war years as evidence of the Holocaust accumulated, and she did not feign a decorous display of shock. This was the end one should have expected from such a beginning. The crimes, she said, were of a peculiar sort because by their very scope and magnitude, they could neither be properly punished nor forgiven. Jews, gypsies, communists, and homosexuals under Hitler's regime, and all persons found deviant from the changing policies of the party in Stalin's regime, were proscribed and from one day to the next transformed into virtually stateless persons. And here lay the peril of all the commercial democracies of the 20th century. They too exhibit many of the relevant symptoms of the general aggrandizement of state power, which had left stateless persons utterly exposed and unprotected from attack, whether by a usurping government in their home country or a revolutionary empire abroad. Some of Arendt's most powerful analysis at the end of part one of Origins of Totalitarianism concerned this unprecedented class of the marooned and helpless, stateless persons. The mere human equality, the moral equality of mankind at large, presumed by the European Enlightenment, an equality of persons defined by our, quote, her line, unexchangeable and unique nature, necessarily exacts, said Arendt, a moral sacrifice, which the world of nations thus far has been unwilling to make on behalf of international rights. So the oppressed individual is thrown back on the exceedingly variable rights of persons under the existing code of powerful states. The refugee, the stateless person, the seeker of asylum in this way typifies the era of world wars as much as the peasant in flight from famine or factory typified the era of the Industrial Revolution. But how could such a fate have befallen the era of improvement that began, we like to think, somewhere between 1776 and 1789? By what means did totalitarian methods somehow draw the compliance of free citizens? What Germany witnessed in the mid-30s, Arendt wrote in her essay, Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship, was not the corralling of stupefied populace by the promises and temptations of a master demagogue. On the contrary, she observed, it was the, I'm quoting, honest overnight change of opinion that befell a great majority of public figures in all walks of life and all ramifications of culture, accompanied as it was by an incredible ease with which lifelong friendships were broken and discarded. In brief, what disturbed us was the behavior, not of our enemies, but of our friends who had done nothing to bring this situation about. They were not responsible for the Nazis. They were only impressed by the Nazi success and unable to pit their own judgment against the verdict of history as they read it. This belief in a determined trajectory, a progressive arc, an irresistible movement of history itself toward an assured goal was the metaphysical fallacy against which Arendt directed her best energies from her first to her latest writings. To the person who says, put yourself on the right side of history, the candid and self-respecting answer can only be, you are asking me to be irresponsible. I've emphasized the original thinking, the areas of exploration in political and philosophical analysis that made Arendt so singular a figure and set her apart from the patterns of scholarly work familiar in her time and place. But it would be partial to forget her association through personal background and history with a larger group of refugee scholars whose presence in American universities enormously enriched our intellectual culture in the mid-century decades. Erwin Panofsky, Leo Lowenthal, Ernst Cassirer, Erich Auerbach, Rudolf Wittkover, Franz Neumann, Leo Spitzer stretch a little beyond Arendt's friends and editors in New York, and these too were her proper company. What they all shared in the nature of a common conviction was distrust of the modern myth of the state and a sense of the uniquely modern privilege of personal consciousness and conscience. This is a gift that comes with inseparable responsibilities, and it is equally senseless to consider it the private possession of an individual or the collective asset of society. The capacity to think, like the ability to judge, is part of the human inheritance, and the largest duty of the thinker is to assure that this endowment of our humanity looks forward to posterity, in part by looking backward to ancestors. Hannah Arendt would have wished to be remembered most of all, I think, not for her taste or her critical gifts, her steady loyalties or her admirations or her prophecies, but rather for just this effort, the fact that she made it and that she never swerved from it, the effort to recall a dignified human inheritance for whatever remnants we can salvage of a common world.
Well, we are indeed indebted to you for that very thoughtful Bromwichian essay. Thank you very much. There may be some points that you particularly emphasize that are relevant to the moment that you'd like to ponder for a moment about.
If you mean ponder out loud, I would say that we're looking at, in the social media, among other ways, and in the, addiction to the making and export of weapons by the United States, some of the symptoms of state power that are already totalitarian or can turn that way. This is not a totalitarian country and not close to it. But I think Arendt practiced, the real ethic of a social critic, which is not to criticize foreign countries for being not up to the standard you would uphold, but your own country for whatever faults it has that might make it turn to the wrong side.
Here's a question from the audience, and a very activist member, in fact, asks you if you see the rise of anti-immigration hate, i.e. build the wall, as evidence of growing totalitarianism in the United States, and what might be other indications of growing totalitarianism. But she says, more importantly, how do we counter this with great humanitarianism? Thank you, Pookie.
Well, immigration in this time of mass emigration is a troubling thing for all states that are relatively free, relatively prosperous, because people from more beleaguered regions want to get a better life. So it seems to me a reasonable policy of regulated immigration is the answer. It's not an answer that Donald Trump's anti-immigration policies, or that the current Democratic administration's pretty much unregulated policies has come up with. So, I mean, for this country has to become more constituted and constitutional in its dedication to solving such problems, for the thing not to get much more out of hand than it is. The idea of building a wall was just a gimmick. Donald Trump didn't even come up with it. One of his publicists did, because he was a builder known for real estate, and then Trump liked it. The wall is neither here nor there. It is a matter of which people enter the country, how to be generous about it, but also not lose track of who people are. That's another way of making them stateless, even within a free state like the US.
Is there any other comment you care to make? You've given us a lot to think about, and we are indeed very appreciative of your contribution and your presence. Is there any other comment?
Nothing further for me. Thanks a lot.
Will we see that published somewhere, I hope?
I don't know, but you've got it on this recording.
Yeah, but I'd like to see it in print too. Thank you again, David Bromwich.
You're welcome.
Our next speaker is Suzanne Nossel, the Chief Executive Officer of PEN America since 2013. Suzanne Nossel has served in leadership roles in the corporate, nonprofit, and government sectors. The author of Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. Suzanne was previously the Chief Operating Officer of Human Rights Watch and the Executive Director of Amnesty International USA. In fact, she spent last week in the Ukraine. She served in both the Obama and Clinton administrations, excuse me, and is a featured columnist for Foreign Policy magazine and a member of Facebook's Oversight Board. That board should meet a little more frequently, Suzanne. It's a pleasure to have you here today. Welcome, Suzanne Nossel.
Thank you so much, Barbaralee. Great to be here with you.
As an activist and defender of free speech, what does Arendt's work mean to you?
I'm not a scholar of Arendt, but her signal role in trying to unpack and elucidate some of the deeper motivations behind the most compelling and disturbing phenomenon of the epoch in which she lived, for me, have been something of an inspiration, I would say, in trying in my own quest, professionally and personally, to wrestle to the ground how we understand the Holocaust, how we address and reckon with the human impulses that drive the gravest devastation that we see. I was just in Ukraine as part of a PEN America delegation earlier this month, and we visited scenes of depravity. We visited a school in a small village outside the city of Chernihiv that was the site of a group of 300 people, villagers, held captive underground in a basement for a month, in essentially in darkness, with no access to facilities. They had to walk outside in the March cold of last winter to relieve themselves, and 11 people died there. And when you go to visit, you could see the flowers and the people that they painted on the walls to occupy the 50 children who were down there. You can see teddy bears and toys left behind, chairs, small bunk beds that children used. And it's sort of this fresh horror and kind of human detritus of evil. And, it makes you think about Arendt. It sort of evokes this recognition that the phenomenon that she described and detailed and analyzed remain very much alive and well in our contemporary society. And so, we turn back to her as we try to make sense of every successive episode.
Well, what do you see as a possible solution to this virulent rise of anti-Semitism in New York, in the United States, throughout the world?
Well, it's complicated. I mean, for me, I've never really spoken about anti-Semitism. And I think that in itself kind of says something. When I was growing up in suburban New York, anti-Semitism seemed like something remote and really oddly so. I mean, I was thinking about when I entered elementary school, the Holocaust had taken place only 30 years before. If you compare that to now, that would be 1992, when the year Bill Clinton was elected. It doesn't feel remote at all. And yet, even though I was educated extensively in what had happened, and there was a great sense that as Jewish children growing up here, we needed to be immersed in it. And I mean, the immersion included at my school creating a Holocaust museum where we brought in old shoes and sort of piled them up and said these were the shoes, and old eyeglasses and said these were the eyeglasses of the people who were marched off to the gas chambers and the ovens. So we had all of that, but there was this great sense of safety in that it was all remote. And we did advocacy on behalf of Soviet Jews, refuseniks, who weren't allowed to leave or to practice their religion. But again, that was far away. And, for me, I remember when I first came to PEN America, I was talking with the writer Nathan Englander, who was describing growing up on Long Island and having coins thrown at him and feeling like anti-Semitism was so present in his daily life. And I was surprised by that. I didn't think anyone in my generation here in the United States, especially in Metro New York, would have had that experience. And so I think, simply beginning to talk about it, I've become just more aware of subtle manifestations. It's easy to kind of reckon with overtly hateful acts. And I think as a society, we talk about those and we agree on those, but there are more subtle ways in which I think it's hard to come to grips with how anti-Semitism kind of pervades and what some of the underlying attitudes are. I see when we deal with these hateful incidents and outbreaks, whether it's Charlottesville or in Buffalo, there's an anti-Semitic dimension to them. Often the manifestos left behind, show deeply anti-Semitic viewpoints coupled with racist and sexist and other forms of bias that kind of underpin this brutal, hateful bias crimes that are committed. But the anti-Semitic dimension is kind of seen as a subplot or an afterthought when these incidents are reported on, and it's sort of almost has to be pointed out that this a white supremacist is also an anti-Semite. And I think it goes to just the way in which a kind of polarized binary polity where, whether it's talking about income inequality and, the very rich and the underprivileged, or talking about binaries of race. And it's become important to talk about those binaries and expose those binaries and point out the power relations that underpin them. But Jews don't fit so neatly into those binaries. They're both privileged and vulnerable. And our anti-Semitism bears things in common with racism, but it's also distinct in a lot of ways. And, of course, nothing is as binary as it may look on first blush. Jews are not the only group that doesn't fit neatly into a binary. So I think the trick is kind of being able to talk about the binaries where it's useful to do so, but also recognize there's so much that straddles across them. And, I think for Jews, we need to get more accustomed and comfortable talking about anti-Semitism and pointing out anti-Semitism. I also think it's extremely important that it not just be a conversation among Jews. And, they're Jews even in, go ahead.
Stephen, that I wanted to make. You referred several times to Jewish people. There are 15 million Jews on Earth and a population of 8 billion. So I don't think, they can be classified as privileged. It's the full range of human experience, which is far from the stereotype. And I do think that one of the fundamental issues, perhaps pervasive in all of society currently, is disinformation, the big lie that is repeated over and over again in all media forms that you are very familiar with. So I wonder if you can think of bold initiatives that include use of technology to move beyond this age of disinformation. It's the root cause of so many issues, including the one we are currently addressing.
Yeah, look, I don't think there's any single silver bullet to move beyond disinformation, but I do think information and reliable, credible information that's presented in engaging ways, including on anti-Semitism. I mean, what I have found is that people really don't know much about it. They may think it started with the Holocaust, it ended with the Holocaust. They don't understand the thousands of years of history, the repeated patterns, the tropes, the complexity of the existence of Israel. And so I think one piece to counter disinformation is education, and doing it in ways that are going to come across to a rising generation and in the media that they utilize. I mean, we do this on free speech. We have education programs directed at youth to engage them in free speech issues, explain why free speech matters to the causes that they care about. And when we do that, they get inspired, they get activated, they become free speech defenders in a generation where that has not been a priority. And I know there's similar efforts focused on Jewish youth. I think it has to move, to your point, beyond Jewish youth to reach more widely. And it needs to be a part of the conversation about how we are bringing people up civically in this country. And that, that can be done through social media, that can be done with video. I think it has to be done face-to-face in school.
How do we get that moving when we keep on seeing, in fact, even the role of television declining and movies declining for other media forms and content that is accessible to wider audience? So how do we move beyond disinformation and lies? We've had 8 or 9 years of a population that has been exposed to lies and more lies, and the repetition of lies and more lies that become a dominant feature of attitudes and often of news. So how do we move beyond that?
It has to be a multifaceted push. Part of it is training people to become more discerning as media consumers so that they're not just drowning in a sea of information, and they can understand what the indicia of validity are and how not to be fooled and led down the garden path, where to turn for reliable information. We do some of that work. There are a lot of organizations doing that work. It needs to be brought to scale. We need to be teaching children. We teach children how to analyze a short story, but we don't teach them how to navigate this ocean of information that they're going to be launched forth into, from as young as 10 or 11 years old when they get a phone. And so our educational system needs to shift gears. There's responsibility in the hands of social media platforms. You mentioned my role on the Facebook Oversight Board. There's a study right now underway by the board looking at health and pandemic-related disinformation, and basically, the Facebook and Meta got much more restrictive in terms of your ability to spread disinformation on the platform during the height of COVID, and you couldn't talk about conspiracy theories, you couldn't question vaccines, and other lines of inquiry and discussion were basically barred on the platform because of the emergency. And the question that they've asked the board is, should those restrictions remain in place permanently? is that level of regulation of speech? And, there were arguments about the lab leak theory that sometimes were suppressed on social media platforms, and people pointed out, look, that was overly restrictive. This needed to be subject to scrutiny and debated. And so they're really difficult questions, and it's multifaceted.
Appropriate to ask you how you respond in that debate?
What do I where do I think the boundaries should be drawn?
Yeah.
I can't answer that, because what I've learned in the board is, and we just issued a big decision last week about Meta's, it's called their cross-check program, but basically the differential treatment that they accord to high-profile users, and the fact that if you are famous or you're a politician, you could put something on Facebook that otherwise would be disallowed and would be removed immediately from the platform as soon as it's flagged. And for you, it remains up there for sometimes days, sometimes a week, sometimes even months, because there are extra layers of review that protect you if you're in that privileged status. And so that's something that we called out very strongly. And what I learned in the course of that and our other work is these things are really complicated, and you have to delve into what the data says, what the researchers say, what the risks are of this disinformation, how good the platform is at discerning between disinformation that's being spread for nefarious purposes and people who are legitimately questioning China's role in the global spread of COVID. And so I've learned there are no easy answers, so I'm not going to give you an easy answer.
Well, since your magna cum laude Harvard undergraduate and law school degrees, there are no easy answers. But now you are in a singular and enviable position of interacting on a daily basis with some of the finest minds and writers and communicators that we have here and abroad. I wondered if you might think of some ways that Penn could be more activist in communicating information rather than disinformation, an issue larger than in any singular topic. And you are never one to shy from a challenge. So please consider that, and consider our gratitude for your joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Very interesting. One of the world's leading experts, Yasha Mounk, is one of the world's leading experts on the crisis of liberal democracy and the rise of populism. His books include The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger, and How to Save It. I hope you'll tell us something about that today. That book has been published in 11 languages, and I suspect Yasha speaks almost all of them. Currently a student of Chinese, I know that. And most recently, his book of this year is called The Great Experiment, Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. That's what we'd really like to know. Your writing has argued that giving up on the prospects of building fair and thriving diverse democracies is not an option. So tell us what actions can be taken to effectively counter the role of business in politics and in journalism, and counter the interest in profit over professionalism that seems to plague all media outlets today. Welcome, Yasha.
Thank you, Barbaralee. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everybody who spoke. It's really meaningful to take part in this commemoration of such a wonderful and important thinker. Let me say a little bit about the question you asked me about, and I have a couple of reflections about Hannah Arendt, but as a very much non-Arendt expert, perhaps I can share at the end.
Whatever you prefer.
I will work it in at the end. I think we are at a moment at which our basic democratic institutions are threatened around the world. I started to write at this point nearly a decade ago. about the rise of authoritarian populism around the world and the way that that threatens our liberal democratic institutions in the United States and European countries and many other countries around the world. And it is, of course, those institutions that can provide a bulwark against the forms of intolerance and discrimination and anti-Semitism that we're rightly concerned about today. I also think that we need to recognize that we are in many ways embarked on a historically unprecedented experiment, and that is trying to build these deeply ethnically and religiously diverse democracies. When you look at most of the countries, most of the democracies in the world, they either used to be quite homogeneous in the past, or they had very clear and explicit racial and religious hierarchies, which gave one group tremendous power over the rest. And what the United States, what most countries in Western Europe, what Australia and many countries in Latin America, what India and some countries in Asia are now doing, is to try to sustain these deeply ethnically and religiously diverse democracies while treating all of the members as equals. And there isn't really a very clear precedent for that. So that, I think, are the stakes of our political moment. And we need to rise to those stakes by making sure that we actually deliver for people, that we ensure that they can have decent lives, that they feel an increase in their standards of living, that they are hopeful that the children and grandchildren are going to do better than they themselves have. It is by creating a narrative, a story of us, a narrative of what it will look like to have a society in which members of minority groups that have historically been excluded or discriminated against, which may continue to suffer disadvantages today, but also members of a historically dominant majority that perhaps in parts are afraid of the changes that are now coming about, have a sense that they have a real place at the table. And in fact, a society in which we might manage to overcome the kinds of boundaries and the kinds of divisions between groups which used to define us, something which recognizes the importance that groups play in human societies and will always play because of the influence it is going to have on people, because of the strength of people's religious convictions, because of their desire to continue to pay homage and honor to the cultural rights of their ancestors, all of which is positive, but also to create a society in which members of those different groups are actually able to see each other as true compatriots, are more likely than they have been in the past and more likely than they are now to make friendships with each other, perhaps to enter into business corporations with each other, to found civil associations with each other, perhaps to intermingle their lives even at a more intimate level. And so to me, that is the sort of great set of challenges. And in order to meet those challenges, we have to have a sense of moral clarity, but we also have to be able to describe the world in its full complexity. We have to be guided by clear values, by our determination to defend these free and tolerant societies against the dangers which encroach on them from all sides, but also to avoid being partisan in the kind of way which makes us unwilling to see failings on, quote unquote, our own side of a political aisle. And one of the many things that I admire about Hannah Arendt is the way in which she always instantiated those virtues.
Can you talk a bit more about the legacy of Hannah Arendt and some of your thinking? Do you see any correlations, influence?
Yeah, well, let me, I'm a great admirer of Hannah Arendt. I have, of course, been reading her work for many years, starting as an undergraduate, but I'm certainly less of an expert on Hannah Arendt than many of the other distinguished speakers we had today. But preparing for this event, I did think about the way in which those virtues I just invoked, that moral clarity and yet that attention to complexity, the clear political taking of position without ever allowing yourself to become a blind partisan is relevant in particular to the topic of anti-Semitism. There is a clear anti-Semitic threat from the right today. We were reminded of it in extreme form a few weeks ago when a former president of the United States, a recent former president of the United States, had dinner with Nuke Fuentes, an extreme far-right figure and quite clearly an anti-Semite. We see it, of course, in countries like Germany, where the Alternative for Germany has tremendously gained in political influence over the last years, and we see it in many other parts of the world today. At the same time, there's also a threat to Jews from parts of the left and from other political quarters. We see a certain intolerance, not just, as we would claim, towards Zionism, but towards all Jews in some progressive spaces, not in all progressive spaces, of course. And we see that sometimes it is not white supremacists, it is not members of a historically dominant majority, but it is members of various minority groups that can also be hostile towards Jews, as is sometimes the case in Western Europe with some immigrants from the Middle East who are responsible for an increase in the number of anti-Semitic crimes in Germany and other countries. And we've seen it even on American soil in things like the terrible attack on Jews in Jersey City, one of the most deadly attacks on Jews in the history of the United States. And there is a temptation, as I think in certain ways Suzanne has implied, not to cover those, to say this is complicating the easy and straightforward narrative we have about the world, and so perhaps let's engage in a kind of small obfuscation in the service of a supposedly larger truth. That is especially tempting in an age of what you might call identitarian moralism on the left as well as the right, in which there is a temptation to say some people, by virtue of a group they belong to, are sure to be good, and other people, by virtue of the group into which they're born, are sure to be problematic. And let's not complicate this by recognizing the fact that you can have experienced injustice, you can be a member of a minority group which often suffers genuine discrimination, and nevertheless turn around and discriminate against members of other minority groups. And this, to me, is where Arendt would provide very real clarity. She would not stand for any of this obfuscation. She has always said in her career what was uncomfortable. She always realized that people could be at once victims and perpetrators, could veer between moral greatness and moral perfidy in the course of decades or years, or sometimes in the course of one conversation as we go from one topic to the next. And I think, therefore, she would, with much greater clarity than much of our public discourse today, be willing and be able to formulate the threat of anti-Semitism in all of its complexity today. And so, since sadly we do not have her doing that for us, we can all aspire to do a little bit of that in her stead.
Well, your point about the victims and perpetrators is both terrifying and trenchant and accurate. But how do you, what seems to have engendered this devolution that has taken place in the recent past? The great lie, is it the dominance of technology and the media that keeps repeating the same packaged ideas? Or is it something?
Yeah, I think Barbaralee, that's a very large part of it, right? So I do think it has something to do with economic stagnation of living standards for a lot of people. It has something to do with the sort of lack of government performance, the feeling that people have if the government isn't really looking out for them, that it's not delivering for them. All of that matters in a real way. But I agree with you that the technological transformation has just been the most extreme. People have always been quite tempted by conspiracy theories. When you go into a barbershop, or you'd go into a cab, or you'd go into as a form of public transport, and you chat with people about what they believe, I think they always were quite willing to endorse conspiracy theories. There's a great opinion poll taken by Pew, I believe, in 1999, before the internet had really penetrated the lives of most Americans, which showed that at the time, about 10% of Americans believed that the moon landing was fake. And today, about 10% of people believe in some version of QAnon. So there's always been a large number of people who hold those kinds of beliefs. The difference with social media is that they become a lot more visible, and that people who want to appeal to those kinds of constituencies can organize much more easily, can reach them much more easily. And that, I think, is at the base of a structural transformation of our politics over the last decade or two. We're not going to be able to get rid of that. I think attempts to try and limit free speech on social media platforms in a way that's somehow going to save us from conspiracy theories don't work. And by the way, they wouldn't have the effect they claim. There's been a study out of Stanford saying the cost of free speech in the COVID pandemic has been hundreds of thousands of lives because of vaccine hesitancy. But you look at China, very, very controlled public sphere, and people in China are even more hesitant to get the vaccine than they are in the United States, because they don't trust that if there were any dangers, they would be informed about them. So the solution here is not to close down free speech. It is not to close down public spheres. But I do hope that...
Sorry. One last comment and question. What would Arendt and Mounk say and give as a possible solution how we can return to a more moderate way of life?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to claim to speak for Arendt. Others here might be able to do that better, but I'll speak for Mounk. I do think, speaking of social media, what I was just saying, we're perhaps starting to see a change in social convention. We're still very, very new to the social media age. The huge influence of Twitter is quite recent. And until a few years ago, there was something exciting about calling people out in social media and saying, you're a terrible person for what you said, and I'm gonna, stir the pot by making these crazy accusations. I think more and more people are turned off by that, and they say, you know what, I can't do that. This is exhausting. If you're stirring the pot in that kind of way, I'm not going to judge the person you're trying to get into trouble. I'm going to judge you for that. And that's, I think, an adaptation of our social norms, which is helpful. And the second thing I will say is that those of us who are not totalitarian, those of us who are not extreme, those of us who are defenders and believers in a system of liberal democracy, should speak with the same passion and with the same engagement and with the same conviction that Hannah Arendt always brought to her work. Part of the problem of the last years is that it has been the extremes who had the passion, who had the conviction, and those of us who are trying to defend our imperfect political system and improve it iteratively have not spoken with the same passion. I think if we are able to recover the passion of Hannah Arendt and perhaps find a few people who have at least some portion of her charisma, we will be able to win the debate and to win the argument, because in the end, most people, including today, most Americans, most people in democracies around the world do believe in those values.
Thank you, Yasha, for your passion, your commitment, and your charisma. It was very good to have you, very informative. Thank you for taking the time to be present today. Yasha Mounk. Our next speaker is President and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice since 2005. Michael Waldman is a constitutional lawyer who served in the Clinton administration as director of speech writing, listen to this fact, nearly 2,000 speeches, including 4 State of the Union and 2 inaugural addresses. His most recent books are The Fight to Vote, 2016, A History of the Struggle to Win Voting Rights for All Citizens, and The Second Amendment, a biography, in 2014. He is also the author of a forthcoming book, June 2023, entitled Supermajority, the Year the Supreme Court Divided America. He is a frequent commentator on national television and radio, writes for the New York Times, Politico, the Washington Post, the Daily Beast, and other national publications. And we are very grateful for his generosity in hosting this program today. However, life has a strange way of intruding. Unfortunately, Michael Waldman is unable to join us in person today. As we speak, he is in the midst of a minor, for an outsider, dental procedure, yet he was very committed to the subject and to the audience. So he has generously recorded his always interesting remarks for your consideration. I posed several questions to him, and he will address them as well as speak about democracy, which is really the bedroot of all our conversation today. The question I posed him was, must we resign ourselves to living with disinformation in a post-factual world? And how can we create common ground for truth and politics? And the third question I posed is, what can Arendt teach us about navigating the fictionalization of our world? Thank you, Michael, and I hope you feel better very soon.
Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Waldman. I'm the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. We are a nonpartisan law and policy institute. We work to reform and strengthen and defend the systems of democracy and justice in our country so they work for all, work that is needed more urgently than ever. I am so sorry that I could not be participating in this live. If I were participating, I would have a mouthful of Novocaine from root canal. So trust me when I say that I really wish I could be there with you instead of what I'm actually doing. But I'm so grateful for the chance to be part of this. We're all so appreciative to Barbaralee and to the Diamonstein-Spielvogel Foundation and the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center for giving us all the opportunity to be part of this interesting and timely and important program. We are all in the middle of a great fight for the future of American democracy and for the future of democracy around the world. Nothing less. We think the stakes are that high. And we're having this conversation about Hannah Arendt at a time when our own world is fractured, when the liberal, rule-based, humanist international order that we at least hoped for, that seemed triumphant, had to face the election of Trump in 2016, January 6th, Brexit, the invasion of Ukraine, the madness of QAnon, and so much else. The world of Brexit and Putin is not the world we wanted to be living in. Once again, as before, we hear a big lie, this time the lie told by the former president of the United States and believed by millions of his followers, that American democracy is a fraud, is rigged. New technologies of communication that make it possible for that lie to race around the world faster than ever before. And alarmingly, but not surprisingly, that hatred has once again found its way to anti-Semitism. When Americans today read The Origins of Totalitarianism or Eichmann in Jerusalem or the other works by Hannah Arendt, we know that back then they were published at a time when people could read them in our country from an easy chair of smug triumphalism after World War II, at a time at least of ideological triumph. That didn't really, in their minds, describe something that might happen here. It was something that happened somewhere else. But we all know that there are far too many echoes of those dark days from that time for all of us to feel similarly secure now. Now, this is not the first time that new technology has brought disruption as well as new information and new communications. And it's not the first time new technology has helped spread mis and disinformation. The same radio that let us hear FDR's fireside chats brought us Father Coughlin. Elon Musk is not the first car manufacturer to use his media platform to spread hatred and anti-Semitism. We all know Henry Ford was there way ahead of him. But we know, too, that hate now spreads faster than ever with fewer guardrails and fewer institutional buffers to block it. Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent had hundreds of thousands of readers. Twitter had hundreds of millions. It's not a fringe website, but the highest rated cable television news program, backed by a major corporation that spews the lie that Jews are planning a great replacement of what Tucker Carlson calls, quote, legacy Americans. Now, we should keep perspective. There's always a lot of noise. It would be a big, big mistake to react in a Pavlovian way to every tweet and every outrage and every bid for attention. But to give one sobering example of why we need to take hate seriously, Kanye West's social media following. He has twice as many social media followers as there are Jews in the world today. That is a sobering thought in understanding how deeply and widely hate can be spread and spewed. So for all of these reasons, and the ones my other colleagues who are talking about today are sharing, the thinking, the analysis, the insight of Hannah Arendt matters a lot to us now, not as a historical curio, but as a guide for how we can understand our own world. She said, quote, the result of a consistent and total substitution of lies for factual truth is not that the lies will now be accepted as truth and that the truth be defamed as lies, but that the sense by which we take our bearings in the real world in the category of truth versus falsehood is among the mental means to this end. That is being destroyed, she wrote then, prophetically now. Consistently lying, she wrote, metaphorically speaking, pulls the ground from under our feet and provides no other ground on which to stand. The result of all of that, of the endless and repeated lying, we all feel a trembling, wobbling motion, she said, of everything we rely on for our sense of direction and reality. Hannah Arendt wrote that totalitarians lie, not because they expect people to believe the lie, but to sow confusion, to make people doubt that there's any meaning between truth and falsehood. She wrote and taught us that totalitarianism feeds not just off anger, but off of boredom and loneliness, not just of hatred, but of apathy. That evildoers could be not only terrifying, but banal. She was trying to explain and understand the forces that had upended her own life, that had hurled her from Germany to France to the United States. She stood for the idea that we had a duty to try to understand. It was not blaming the victim, to ask what larger forces moved history in such a dark direction. She wanted to understand not just Hitler, but his bureaucrats and his followers who filled the holes in their lives by their commitment to his lies. Now, what about all of us? What do we have to do at a moment like this, facing challenges that, while not the same, have far too many echoes? How do we respond to this unsettling world? I'd say she would tell us that we too have to understand that it's not blaming the victim or normalizing white supremacy, to ask why so many millions of Americans have turned to hate right now. There's always been racism in this country. There's always been hatred here and everywhere else. Why now has it been given so much voice? Why now do tens of millions of people believe the election was stolen? Why do so many fall for the mass delusion and, yes, the blood libel of QAnon, which still says that elites are eating the blood of children? Even as we try to understand this, and we have to try to understand this, we have to do something else. We have to act. Totalitarianism triumphs not because the public turns against democracy, turns against constitutional government, but because those who care about liberal democracy don't do enough to support it. So it's up to all of us to heed that lesson of history, to fight just as fiercely for the institutions of liberalism and self-government as those who would tear it down. We don't have the luxury of disaffection. Democracy dies with a shrug. So we have to fight fear with facts. We have to fight lies with truth. We have to fight the big lie with the biggest truth of all, that people matter, that people are equal, and that everybody on this call and all of us have to do something about it to live up to that idea. To me, that is the legacy for us here and now of Hannah Arendt, the continued vitality of her work and our own task for years to come. Thank you again for giving me and us the chance to be part of this.
Oh, thank you, Michael Waldman. That was the state of our union and a coda and a message that we will all take very seriously. And now, the genesis of this program is to place a beautifully designed pro bono by the late Massimo Vignelli, a cultural medallion, a porcelainized cultural medallion, of which there are approximately 135 in the 5 boroughs. I've asked Jana Schmidt to read the text of this cultural medallion that will be affixed to 370 Riverside Drive on a far less inclement day in the spring. Jana Schmidt, would you please read the text of the medallion?
Yes, gladly. Hannah Arendt, 14th of October 1906 to 4th of December 1975, at 370 Riverside Drive in Manhattan. A humanist writer and philosopher whose guiding principle was to think what we are doing, Hannah Arendt thought boldly about our shared political world. Born in Hanover, Germany in 1906, Arendt studied under Martin Heidegger and Karl Jaspers. Arrested by the Nazis for her work with German Zionism in 1933, she fled to Paris and then escaped from a detention camp in Gurs, France. She arrived in New York in 1941 a stateless Jewish refugee. Arendt's major books include The Origins of Totalitarianism, 1951, The Human Condition, 1957, and Eichmann in Jerusalem, 1963, which redefined our understanding of the Holocaust, 3 of the most influential books of the 20th century. She also published Between Past and Future, Men in Dark Times, Crisis of the Republic, and On Revolution. She lived at this address from 1959 to 1975 and is buried in the Bard College Cemetery.
Thank you, Jana. Thank you, brilliant panelists. Thank you, worthy audience. We will see you again in the spring. But in the meantime, I want to thank all those who participated in this exciting, informative, and timely program and who helped make it possible. The master videographer, Alex Lakowski. But thanks most of all to our audience and the outstanding Brennan Center. If any of you know of an individual who's made a significant contribution and have verifiable information about where they resided or worked in a building that still exists, please let us know. Thanks to each and all of you for joining us today, for celebrating the remarkable life and work of Hannah Arendt. Thank you all.